Hello everybody! Today we're going to be talking about psychobiological basis of behavior, which is going to be kind of a review of physiology and anatomy, but for the brain. For you nursing students, you're going to be familiar with a lot of these concepts, but we're just going to hone in a little extra on some of the things that we're going to cover. First, we're going to do a general review of the neuroanatomy of the brain. As you know, we have the central nervous system, which consists of the brain and the spinal cord. And the spinal cord, moves messages from the brain to the rest of the body. And then we're going to have the peripheral nervous system, which is everything, all the nervous system that runs out of the spinal cord to the rest of the body. Very basic so far. If you zoom out and you look at the brain from the top, we would be able to divide the brain in two hemispheres. The left brain functions, or the left hemisphere, usually talks about, addresses analytic thought, logic, language, reasoning, science and math, written skills, number skills, and it controls your right hand movement or your right side movement. For the right brain functions, we have the more artsy stuff, art awareness or perception, creativity, imagination, intuition and insight, holistic thought. So this is what's going to be connecting with those principles of betterment and maybe even religious and faith beliefs, music awareness, 3D forms, and it controls your left side, left hand and left side. It also addresses visual spatial recognition, experiential tasks, attention, and some emotions. And they are connected by the corpus callosum. Basically connects the two and allows communication as a pathway between the two hemispheres of the brain. Talking a little bit more about the nervous system pathways, they transmit information via pathways through the central nervous system. A neuronal pathway in the brain is what we call a bundle of neurons or a track. But these bundles of pathways, neuropathways in the rest of the body is what we typically call a nerve. And you can actually see in an autopsy, you can actually see the nerve, the bundles of neurons connected one to another as a nerve. When you look at it from the brain perspective, what you're going to see is first, you're going to see the organ, but if you hone in with the microscope and everything, that's when you start seeing the bundles of neurons connected. The parts of the neurons are three. The cell body or the core, if you can picture the neuron like my hand and the arm. The palm of the hand is the cell body or the soma. The axon is the forearm here, and the dendrites that come out of the axon at the terminal portion of the axon, but also if this is the soma, the dendrites also come out of the body to connect with other cells. So the neurons are connecting from neuron to neuron like this, like this. This is the soma and the dendrites of another neuron connected to the end of the axon. The types of neurons are sensory or afferent, motor or efferent, and association neurons. So the cell body or soma carries genetic information, maintains the neuron structure, and provides energy to the cell. This is the part where the now I forgot the word. This is the part where the metabolism of the cell and all the other organelles of the cell are, including the part that I am forgetting right now. The axon carries impulses away from the cell body to the terminal, and sometimes the axon is myelinated, which means that it has another type of neuron wrapped around it to insulate it and protect it from electric activity from other neurons, but also to produce a faster conduction from one neuron to the next. And then the dendrites are fibrous roots that branch out of the body, and they receive the impulses from neurons and transmit them to the cell of the body. These are the different types of neurons. As you can see, there are like 5 different types of neurons, and some of them, as you see on this slide on the neuron on the left, is a Purkinje cell in the cerebellum. They have up to 10,000 dendrites in just that one cell. And so imagine having thousands and thousands of neurons of this type specifically that have thousands of dendrites, and they are all connecting, looking for each other, how they're going to connect. And now we're going to talk a little bit more in depth about how that connection happens. So I already told you that some of the neurons have a myelin sheath that helps insulate and protect the axon of the neuron in addition to the cell body, okay? This is to increase the conduction speed. And when we have degenerative disorders like multiple sclerosis, this is the problem, that the myelin sheath that surrounds the axon of the cell is damaged or it's dying, basically. So now the neurons are going to be slower, and sometimes they're going to be deteriorate or even die because they don't have the myelin sheath and they're supposed to have it. It can affect motor skills, etc. So we're going to hone in just a little bit more on the neurons and how they connect and talk to each other. Between neuron and neuron, as you know, there is something called the synaptic gap, okay? And this is where a lot of this activity of communication happens. So you have the presynaptic neuron and the postsynaptic neuron, and the presynaptic neuron has the body of the cell over here with the dendrites of it connecting to the other neurons. And at the end of the axon over here, you're going to have the presynaptic axon terminals that will connect with the synapses of the postsynaptic neuron body, okay? Just the way that you're looking at it in the picture. Now, what happens in the space between the one neural's terminal, synaptic terminal, and the beginning of the other is what we call the presynaptic, is what we call the synaptic cleft. What happens is, I'm going to go back to the previous slide, that when the chemical electrical transmission happens from the beginning of the body of the cell down through the axon to the next one, when the message reaches the axon terminal of the presynaptic neuron, the electrical discharge forces, almost, you could say, the synaptic vesicles to secrete the neurotransmitter and release it into the synaptic cleft, where the receptors of the other neuron are waiting to receive the neurotransmitter. And that's basically how it happens. It's a chemical electrical charge. The electrical charge, it happens because of the chemical reactions in the cell. The message travels. When it gets to the axon terminal of the presynaptic neuron, it releases into the synaptic cleft the neurotransmitters that the postsynaptic neuron are waiting to receive into its postsynaptic receptors. So think about every one of these connections that happen, all of these thousands and millions of neurons that connect and communicate that way and begin to bundle together, and then they begin to fire together, and that's what we call neuropathways. So if you can imagine this in your mind like a really complex, in layers, many of these neuropathways, like a really complicated and complex system of highways, like the picture that we have here. But thousands of times more complex in the brain, of course. Zooming out a little bit in the concepts, we're going to discuss briefly the autonomic nervous system, because this is really important. We have the autonomic nervous system is divided into 3 areas. Some people include the enteric nervous system into this, and some don't, but I will. So we have the parasympathetic system, which is basically it's a cholinergic system, and it conserves energy. This is the part that is involved with rest and relaxation. For example, when we are going to eat a meal, we need usually a peaceful environment so that we can rest and digest. That you even have heard probably that terminology. For the parasympathetic system, think rest and digest. For the sympathetic system is the opposite. This is the one that spends energy. This is the one involved in the fight and flight, in inactivity, in stress. So this is what you don't want when you're eating your food. And then the enteric nervous system is everything related to the gastrointestinal tract from beginning to end. It encompasses, it has connections to the sympathetic and parasympathetic system. In the parasympathetic system is connected via the vagus nerve, and with the sympathetic system connects via the prevertebral ganglia. Now we're going to zoom out again and talk about neurotransmitters, because there are many different kinds of neurotransmitters in the brain and throughout the whole body for all of this neuronal activity to happen. The cholinergic group consists of only one, acetylcholine. Then we have the monoamines. These are usually hormones that also double function as neurotransmitters. They are distributed throughout the entire central nervous system and also throughout the peripheral nervous system. So they regulate consciousness, cognition, attention, emotion, and you do recognize some of these, norepinephrine, epinephrine, dopamine, histamine, serotonin. These are hormones and neurotransmitters at the same time. Then you have neuropeptides. We also recognize these, endorphins, enkephalins. Some of these are anti-inflammatories. Endorphins give you energy, makes you feel good. And we also have opioid peptides. These are your endogenous opioid neurotransmitters that help address pain. In the amino acids, we have one of the big ones, and that's GABA. And GABA is neurotransmitter that is inhibitory, so it has a tendency to calm the brain down and calm neuronal activity. Glycine is another amino acid, and then glutamine is a really interesting one because the glutamine in itself is not a neurotransmitter. It's an amino acid that is used as a precursor for the neurotransmitters of glutamate and aspartate, which are excitatory neurotransmitters, and also a precursor for GABA. So we do need glutamine. Glutamine is basically a foundational amino acid to form proteins. So we get it from protein sources, and it's stored in the muscles. So an interesting side note, the glutamine is one that the body also uses as a foundation to produce white blood cells. So when we are fighting a low immune system because of either cancer treatment or too many diseases at the same time, your immune system is low, supplement with some glutamine because it will help you to not go to the glutamine storage source, which is in the muscles. That may be the case that may be why when you see somebody who is deathly ill, all of a sudden they look emaciated, and it's because the body went after the glutamine in the muscles of the body to get it out and use it to manufacture white blood cells for the immune system. And then finally we have in this other category things like anandamide, which and the endocannabinoids, which are neurotransmitters. The anandamide is a fatty acid, and the endocannabinoids are lipid-based neurotransmitters. These are all the ones that we make that attach to our endocannabinoid receptors. So I used to wonder sometimes why was it that we respond so well to plant-based endocannabinoids like marijuana, or the opioid like the poppy seed, why? And I that was before I came to nursing, before I became a nurse, when I discovered it made perfect sense that we do have endogenous substances and neurotransmitters that are designed to attach to the receptors. We already have them built in. Receptors for opioid-like substances and cannabinoids. Same thing for nicotinic. We have nicotinic receptors, right? Who knew before I came to nursing? Nitric oxide is another one that is an intracellular messenger, and the role, it has a role in blood flow in the brain to improve circulation in the brain, intracellular signaling, and for example, if somebody has low levels of nitric oxide, they're going to have a reduction of dopamine and endorphins, which produces anxiety. The corticotropins, for example, are a hormone also that stimulates the adrenal cortex. So those are the different types, four major types of neurotransmitters, and then several others under the other classifications. Just a little bit more about anticholinergics. Now that we know about acetylcholine being the only cholinergic neurotransmitter, this has everything to do with dementia caused by Alzheimer's disease. So it's important for us to understand the function of acetylcholine and anticholinergic medications. So an anticholinergic medication or substance is basically opposing the actions of the neurotransmitter acetylcholine. And the side effects, as you probably already are familiar because we took pharmacology already, dilated pupils, decreased lacrimation. You have to think of the anticholinergics as an agent that dries the body. That's why we have decreased lacrimation, dry mouth. It slows the bladder and bowel function. It can produce tachycardia, sedation, dizziness, etc. Some examples of anticholinergics are some Parkinson medications like Cogentin, and antihistamines like Benadryl, notorious. Don't give Benadryl to the elderly. We will cover that when we are talking about geriatrics. Antipsychotics like Thorazine, and then some medications like clomipramine for OCD. But I can't resist the temptation, so I'll tell you now that Benadryl we don't give to the elderly because it can actually induce delirium in them. It can really mess with their balance, and now they become even more compromised as a risk for fall. It's a sedation, and also the Benadryl, which is so harmless on its own, but if you combine it with other medications that are respiratory suppressants and sedatives, for example, it can be a really, really bad combination, including Benadryl with alcohol. But we will cover Benadryl at a later time in the semester. Now we're going to begin to look at the big picture of the brain, and then we're going to start honing in to the different areas. The brain as a whole is made of three major areas. The cerebrum, which interprets signals from the body, forms responses like emotions, pain, hunger, etc. The cerebellum, which controls movement, balance, posture, and coordination. And then the brainstem, which has a lot to do with involuntary functions like your heart rate, your blood pressure, and your respiration. Now beginning to zoom in a little bit, the parts of the brain. And today, for the purposes of psychiatric nursing, we want to focus more on the cerebrum part, not so much the cerebellum and the brainstem. We will talk about those two, and they definitely are involved in the brain functions that we will need to address through the semester. But the cerebrum is the one that has more to do with behavioral issues and symptoms of the mental illnesses that we will address. So as you can see on this slide, the parts of the brain that we were talking about. The cerebrum has 4 parts, and this is basically the cerebral cortex. I want you to start making the picture in your mind of the brain as the core that encompasses the limbic system, the basal ganglia, the diencephalon. This is part of the cerebrum, and it also mixes with the cerebellum and the brainstem. But this is the center of the brain. And then the cortex, if you can picture a helmet made of brain tissue that goes over this piece in the center. Okay, so we're going to look at the cerebrum, which is the whole cerebral cortex of the brain, the limbic system that goes in the center, along with the basal ganglia and the diencephalon, all working together to produce behavior, emotions, memory, instinctual responses, etc. The cerebellum is divided in 2 hemispheres, and the brainstem, which has the midbrain, the pons, and the medulla oblongata. We don't need to go into those functions. On the cerebrum parts, I want just to make the note from here on that when you see something that I wrote in red, is important for you to remember. We're going to use that information. You're going to hear me talking about that a lot for the rest of the semester because it has to do with the behavioral illnesses that we're going to be talking about and the medical physiological reason of them. Okay, so on the cortex, the cerebral cortex, I want you to remember specifically the frontal cortex. You're going to hear me talk a lot about frontal cortex. Frontality also is when the frontal cortex suffers in its development and maturity. You hear sometimes, you have heard probably when people say that girls don't fully develop their frontal cortex until they reach about 23. And males until they reach about 26. That's the last part of the brain to fully mature. And beautifully, this is the part of the brain where we make our highest decisions, our highest function decisions. This is where that common sense comes with your moral and ethical values, connect with the rest of all the functions of your decisions and behaviors. So that's the big importance of the frontal lobes. And then you have your temporal, your parietal, your occipital lobes. And then now zooming in deeper into the cerebrum, we have the limbic system. And in the limbic system, like I said, it's like that fist in the center of the brain. That's where you're going to find your hippocampus, where we form and store memories. Okay, and then the amygdala oblongata. The amygdala is where we produce and attach emotions to your experiences so that then you can store them in the hippocampus, complete with everything that you will remember will include how you felt throughout the experience. And then the hypothalamus cortex connections. That's where it begins to connect with the other part of the brain that has the involuntary reactions. For example, you feel afraid. You don't will your body to accelerate your heart rate and your respiration and all the different things and the release of glucose into the muscle so that you can fight or flight. You don't think about doing those things. But if your limbic system didn't have the connection to the hypothalamus area, then those things wouldn't have the opportunity to respond to what the limbic system is perceiving and doing. I hope that makes sense. But anyway, the basal ganglia, the part that I want you to remember here is your nucleus accumbens and the substantia nigra. The substantia nigra is where we manufacture dopamine, okay? The ventral tegmental area is where we store that dopamine, which then releases it to the nucleus accumbens like a cycle. And we did touch on this during our front loading. So the nucleus accumbens runs on dopamine. And so you can start seeing that cycle happening. And then the encephalon, which has everything related to thalamus, which is related to involuntary function. These are just the pictures, just to give you that mental picture and a reminder of your cortex, and how you can see in the picture on the left how the cortex creates that illusion of like a helmet surrounding the limbic system, and then your brainstem. I love this picture. It's a really good picture. Okay, now we're going to start digging a little deeper on the cerebrum function. The cerebrum makes up most of the nervous system in the brain. It has the cortex. We already talked about sensory integration, thought, voluntary movement, language, reasoning, perception, all that wonderful stuff from the cortex, and particularly the frontal cortex. But of course, we have from the rest of the cortex perceiving all the sensations, the sensory input that we get from outside or from our environment through the senses, hearing, sight, smell, huge. The olfactory one is huge for recollecting memories, etc., and imprinting into memories. That's why you may smell something years later, and then it brings you instantly to a place, a time. You remember what you were doing, what things smelled, everything triggered by just the smell. The limbic system, which we just touched on, emotions, motivation, memory, and a sense of pleasure, because the limbic system runs on dopamine. The basal ganglia, it plans and modulates movement. It has everything to do with proper muscle tone and voluntary movement, but it also is involved with memory, eye movement, the reward processing, and the motivation. And then the diencephalon, which controls many autonomic functions, and it assists in the generation and management of emotions and memories. So as you can see, all of this flows beautifully together. They work with each other. So this is just a little bit about the cerebral cortex. The frontal lobes we already addressed: emotions, reasoning, planning, movement, parts of speech, creativity, etc. The temporal has everything to do, of course, with hearing. Some of that definitely memory, because if you can't hear, you can't remember. You can't remember something you did not hear. It has to do with meaning and language, emotion and learning, involved with interpreting and processing auditory stimuli. The parietal, back here, processing of nerve impulses related to the senses, language functions, and then the occipitals have a lot of connections with the eyes and sight and recognition of objects. Here, once again, is the picture of all of your cortex parts. And now we're going to talk a little bit, honing in the limbic system. The limbic system, like we said, is involved in instinctual responses and behaviors. It has to do with feeding, memory consolidation, as we saw, sense of pleasure, it runs on dopamine, emotions that are attached to memories and events and experiences, motivational behaviors, which kind of goes tied to survival and instinctual behaviors, and also with the sense of pleasure. motivational behaviors, for example. You could be motivated to do something because your survival and instinctual behaviors are the ones driving you. Or you could be motivated to do something that produces great pleasure that is not attached necessarily to your survival and instinctual behaviors like in addiction. It could be that you're highly motivated to serve because it really gives you great pleasure to serve. That has everything to do with dopamine releases, but in a different way than with the compulsive drive of survival and instinctual behaviors in that case. So the limbic system parts, again, I don't expect you to memorize every single part of the limbic system, but to at least have a general idea of what's happening in the limbic system, because this is crucial for us to understanding behavior. So the limbic system, the limbic cortex, septal area, cingulate gyrus, they all have wonderful functions. I'm not too concerned about that. I do want you to notice, as you can see in red on the slide, the hippocampus. I already told you why, because this is where we store memories. The amygdala, I already said why, because this is what attaches feelings and emotions to those memories, which will determine future behavior, of course. And the septal area and the connections to the hypothalamus. So now we zoom out a little bit. What are the structures that the limbic system works with? Okay, remember that the main areas in the limbic system that I want you to remember are the amygdala, that controls emotions and is involved in setting memories, and the hippocampus, where we store them. So these limbic system areas, the limbic system as a whole, works with the frontal cortex, where the executive control over thought, actions, and emotions come from. Remember, we talked about this in front loading. This is where the stop switch is for any behaviors that are not in alignment with our moral compass, okay? Or with common sense, or with learned, what we know to be the right thing to do or the appropriate thing to do, etc. Nucleus accumbens and the VTA, ventral tegmental area in the basal ganglia, which is involved with motivation, reward and pleasure, addiction, impulsivity, and risk-taking behaviors. It's also involved in the control of survival and reproductive behaviors. One interesting thing about impulsivity and risk-taking behaviors. Certain mental illnesses, for example, schizophrenia, we have found that people, you know, that schizophrenia sets in for the first time around age, in the teen years, most likely, or early 20s. And it is characterized, one of the things that we need to do, there is hypofrontality with patients with schizophrenia, meaning that the frontal cortex has not had a chance to mature fully, or is hindered, and they don't have very good social skills. And so that's what I'm talking about. Impulsivity, risk-taking behaviors, not very social. They need help, coaching. That's all of that connection going on. The hypothalamus and the in the diencephalon connects with the limbic system to control body temperature, emotions, hunger, thirst, appetite, digestion, and sleep, which, as you know, are involuntary things. The limbic functions we already talked about. The olfactory receptors are capable of odor detection and differentiation. Smells have different effects on motivational behaviors and memory. And they can evoke emotions based on the memories that we have related to the experience. Feeding functions. Hypothalamus is involved with feeding and feeling full, satiety. Memory consolidation, sense of pleasure, we already covered all of these. And this is a more clear picture of what I was telling you before. There is the limbic system in the center, there's the cortex surrounding it, and you can see in this picture the hippocampus, the amygdala, the thalamus, how everything is like really, really packaged together, nice and close by and tight. And this one is by far one of my very favorite slides in most of my presentations, because we have a perfect picture of how it works together. The frontal cortex with your stop switch, the limbic system in the nucleus accumbens with the do it again, go, green light, go over and over and over, and how all of these little areas in the brain are connected together. The ventral tegmental area storing the dopamine, the substantia nigra producing the dopamine and storing it there, releasing it to the nucleus accumbens, amygdala attaching memories to those experiences, putting it in the hippocampus as a permanent memory. Now, the basal ganglia is the last part of the 4 parts of the cerebrum. The basal ganglia system balances excitatory and inhibitory neurons. We talked about GABA being an inhibitory, aminobutyric acid. GABA is an inhibitory calming neurotransmitter for the brain and the nervous system, and glutamate is an excitatory neurotransmitter that makes the neurons fire and fire and fire. So these are the main transmitters in the basal ganglia. Let me see what else. Acetylcholine is another primary excitatory neurotransmitter and is involved in memory. That's why when a person suffers from Alzheimer's disease, what they have is a deficiency of acetylcholine. And the problem here is, the reason why it's incurable, we haven't found the cure yet, is that you can supplement all the acetylcholine you want, but the neurons, the cholinergic neurons, have died or are dying, so there are no neurons with the receptors for the acetylcholine to be able to function in relation to memory. And similarly is what happens with Parkinson's. In that case, you have substantia nigra neurons dying, which are the ones that produce dopamine, and the dopaminergic neurons are dying, so that you don't have enough producing or absorbing, receiving dopamine. So it doesn't matter how much dopamine we put in the system. If you don't have the dopaminergic neurons to receive it and metabolize it and accept it and use it, then you're going to have neurological problems related to dopamine. So dopamine can be either excitatory or inhibitory depending on the receptors of the neurons that it comes in contact with. So dopamine is responsible for repetitive behaviors, reward experiences, and focusing attention. The parts in the basal ganglia that I want you to remember, they are all important, but for the purposes of studying behavior in psychiatric nursing, the nucleus accumbens in the ventral striatum, and the substantia nigra, where we produce dopamine. They call it substantia nigra, by the way, because it's super rich in dopaminergic neurons, and they have a darker color than the rest of the brain. The basal ganglia and the limbic system basically control human behavior. And here is a picture of your prefrontal cortex, the basal ganglia, the limbic system, the nucleus accumbens, and you can see again, and on the next one too, how beautifully wrapped together everything is. Everything in its place, everything with the very specific function, everything working together. The diencephalon parts have everything related to the thalamus and its function. So the thalamus relays information between the brain parts, processes sensory information from the external environment, regulates awake and sleep cycles and the circadian rhythms. It has to do with the pineal gland being able to detect light via the optical nerve, and then releasing melatonin if it's dark so that it signals to go to sleep. All of these wonderful functions are related to the thalamus and its parts. The diencephalon also includes other parts like the optic tracts, posterior pituitary gland, and the pineal gland. The thalamus and hypothalamus are two closely linked neural structures that play important roles in maintaining homeostasis and regulating various physiological processes. And these complex brain regions work together to process sensory information, to regulate consciousness and awake cycles, and other key bodily functions. We talked about these. It connects structures to the endocrine system with the nervous system, works with the limbic system structures to generate and manage emotions and memories. And this is just a picture of its parts. Now I want to talk about the clinical application briefly. Why is it important? Why does all of this information matter? Remember what I said in the front loading, that when I went to nursing school, I used to wonder, why do we have to know all of this? We're not going to medical school. We're not going to be diagnosing anything. Yes, but as the nurse, we have to understand everything that the doctors know and understand, because we are their hands, their ears, and their eyes. We are the ones providing the hands-on patient care. And they're not there like we are with the patient, but they need to know everything that we know so that they can know the next right thing to do in treating the patient. And so what is the clinical application of this information, for example, with regards to schizophrenia? Okay. We have found, for example, that there is an increased ventricular size related to decrease in gray matter and white matter of the cortex in patients with schizophrenia. And I touched on this a little bit earlier. So it is believed, for example, that maybe this is caused by a decreased blood flow, particularly to the frontal cortex, producing hypofrontality. And now, if you have a decreased frontal cortex and frontal cortex function, you're going to have issues with impulsivity, because the stop switch, remember, is in the frontal cortex. Risky behaviors, not so social or so skilled with social behaviors, etc. There's also the dopamine hypothesis that says that schizophrenia, the more we study it over time, we have found that we used to think that schizophrenia was just lack of dopamine. No, too much dopamine. And so we started producing medications to decrease the levels of dopamine. And then we started discovering that schizophrenia is actually more excess of dopamine in one part of the brain and not enough in another part of the brain. And so decreased and increased levels in different parts of the brain that we need to address differently with medication and treatment. With depression, for example, why is it important to understand everything that we just covered? Well, because in depression, we know now that we have decreased amounts of serotonin, but now we discovered that norepinephrine is also involved in depression, and dopamine, but especially serotonin and norepinephrine. And we have been developing medications that address both, right? New research may examine acetylcholine, dopamine, and GABA involvement. For example, there is one type of depression, anxious depression, that may need to be treated with some GABA, some medications that address GABA, increasing GABA, so that it has a calming effect on the person. This is the reason why, too, people with anxiety may have a tendency to develop an addiction with alcohol or benzodiazepines, which increase the effects of GABA in the brain. They're looking for relief. More clinical applications. In anxiety disorders, decreased GABA produces anxiety. So now we need to administer medications that activate GABA receptors so that they have a calming effect. Norepinephrine, dopamine, and serotonin may have a role also in anxiety. And then there's dementia with Alzheimer's, which is, it produces brain atrophy, and it has the presence of neurofibrillary tangles and amyloid plaques. And we don't really know if the amyloid plaques, for example, are a cause of Alzheimer's or a result of Alzheimer's. We're still researching. One thing for sure we know now is that there is definitely brain inflammation is involved in the development of Alzheimer's, and also excess of sugar. We are calling now Alzheimer's diabetes type 3 for that reason. The ventricles in Alzheimer's are also enlarged because there's brain shrinkage due to the cholinergic neuronal death in the brain. And of course, the memory loss comes from loss of cholinergic pathways that are just not there anymore. And then more examples on why it's important for us to understand everything we just talked about. In Parkinson's disease, I already touched on this too. This is a disease that affects motor function and emotional stability. There is a deterioration of the basal ganglia and substantia nigra, primary site of dopaminergic neurons, which, as I said, have everything to do with the production of dopamine. Decreased dopamine in the extrapyramidal system is what will produce the symptoms of tremors and imbalance, motor function with Parkinson's disease. So some of the symptoms in Parkinson's are resting tremors, bradykinesia, rigidity, etc. And then we have other degenerative disorders like the diseases where the myelin sheath of the axons of the neurons basically deteriorate and die. Demyelinating diseases. Anorexia nervosa is another one. When you have trauma or injury to the brain, chemical dependency. Mitochondrial, that's the word that I was forgetting in the beginning of the lecture. The mitochondria is the energy factory where we metabolize nutrients for energy in the cell. And that was the word that I was forgetting in the beginning, that lives in the cell, in the body of the cell of the neurons. Anyway, there are other degenerative disorders related to the mitochondrial problems in the DNA, and also early life stress in trauma. The last thing I wanted to show you at a glance here is just a neurotransmitter chart, and you can see here how too little acetylcholine is what's going to be manifested as Alzheimer's disease. And too much acetylcholine can give us muscle spasms. Too little dopamine will manifest as Parkinson's disease. Too much dopamine can manifest symptoms of schizophrenia and drug addiction. Too little serotonin can produce depression and mood disorders. Too much, we have found, that can produce symptoms of autism. Too little norepinephrine can give you mental disorders, especially depression, but too much of it can produce anxiety. GABA, too little of it, can produce anxiety symptoms. Too much of it, sedation, sleep and eating disorders. Endorphins, too little of it, you have chronic pain. Too much of it, the body may not give adequate warning about pain, and it can give you also an artificial high. And then finally, glutamate, too little of it can produce insomnia, brain fog, trouble concentrating, mental exhaustion, depleted energy, because remember, glutamate is an excitatory neurotransmitter. So if we don't have enough of it, we're not going to feel the same energy to produce work. But too much glutamate can definitely be damaging to the neurons and produce seizures or too much neuronal activity, anxiety, restlessness, etc. So this concludes our study of the brain. A lot of it, as you probably have seen, was a good review from anatomy and physiology of the brain. And we also looked at some of the reasons why this is important for us to know in psychiatric nursing. And that concludes our lecture today. Thank you.